Thanks.
but I'm sure there's others.
Okay. So thank you, Paul. So what we had said last week on Friday is that if you're raising birds on your property, you have to distance them 50 amos. And what I was just saying before I pressed the record button is that there's a machlokes, as we'll see in just a moment, as to what the source of this halacha is. Because in the parentheses, the last thing that's stated is that if the majority of the fields of the city are owned by non-Jews, then you are permitted to raise your pigeons in the city. And the question, of course, is what's the issue? Is this a form of damage, or is this some kind of lifnim mishuras hadin above the letter of the law, where it's not actual damage? Because we know that you're not allowed to damage a non-Jew's property, right? There's no heter for you to go ahead and say, well, it's because if it's a Gentile, I'm not commanded to distance my animals. So it's a very strange statement in the very end. So the Imrei Yaakov just simply says over here, the imlo hirchi kashovach min ha'ir, v'holchu v'hiziku im chayev l'shalem. Let's say you did not distance your pigeons, and they went ahead and started damaging your neighbor's property. Talia b'pluktat rishonim. This is actually a machlokes among the medievalists as to whether you have to pay or not, whether there's compensation, whether there's actual damage or not. So what's the issue? So if we're just going to scroll down to the Shar Hatziyun, where he provides source material for this, he writes, he says, Ayin kitzos hachoshen simin kufnan he sifkat tes. So there's a very important sefer called the Kitzos HaChoshen, which is sort of an in-depth commentary on many issues of Choshen Mishpat. And he writes as follows. He says, Deladas HaRamban lo chayev behu mishum shein. You know, one of the damages, there's different categories of damage that your animals do. There's Keren, Shein, and Regel. Those are the three header categories. Keren is where your animal maliciously goes ahead and causes damage to another party. That's why it's called Keren, because the word Keren means a horn. So if I own a bull and the bull goes ahead and gores someone, that's malicious damage, and that's one category of damage. Regel is where my animal, literally means foot, is where my animal in the course of doing its normal activity goes ahead and kicks, let's say, a rock, and the rock hits, becomes a projectile and ends up breaking a window or something like that. So that's another kind of damage where it was done unintentionally by the animal non-maliciously. But then there's a third category of damage called shein, where the animal is not malicious, but is doing something that gives it pleasure. That's why the word shein means tooth. Like the animal goes ahead and starts chewing on your property, on something, on some vegetation that belongs to you. Or let's say you have an animal that has an itch and it starts rubbing itself against the wall, right? And the wall collapses as a result of this big cow rubbing itself against the wall habitually. So that's the category of damage that we're talking about now, where I have birds. The birds are hungry. They're not acting maliciously, but they're doing what birds do, which is to peck away at someone else's food, so at someone else's seeds. So the Ramban says, Kaven, that you're not liable for that form of damage over here. Kaven she'eno kinyan Torah, ve'eno elo mishum darchei shalom. He says a very interesting concept. He says, when it comes to pigeons, I haven't really technically acquired the pigeons. The pigeons don't really belong to me because I haven't done anything to make them mine. All I've done is I've created a habitat on my property to let these birds fly and rest and have some water and have some bird seed and let them be able to relax, whether they're flying north or south. They're flying south for the winter and they want to just rest in my place, that's fine. they may come and flock. If you've ever been to the Hula Valley, you ever seen the billion birds that come to the Hula Valley? Literally, a billion birds come because it's that place in Israel, in the north of Israel, which acts as the perfect migratory stop for birds that are flying from Europe to Africa, that are flying south for the winter. And
it's closer to your old neighborhood, the what are the swallows in Capistrano or something like that?
Yeah. Actually, I never went to see the swallows in Capistrano, but I should have. Maybe one day I'll go. I know exactly where it is. But anyway, but it's sort of something like that, right? So the argument goes like this: these birds don't really belong to me. I'm just enabling them to have a place to rest. And so if they go ahead and do damage, it's not really traceable to me in a significant way. So because they don't belong to me. So therefore, the rabbis instituted the law based on darchei shalom. You want to preserve the peace and welfare of the neighborhood. And by preserving the peace and welfare, they said, don't do this. But b'di'evet, if I did it, am I liable? So then the answer is, well, technically, no, I'm not liable. It was a rule that was instituted that restricts me from doing this. But if I do it, what are the penalties? And so that's the argument. The Ramban says that there's no penalty based on the fact that it's not real damage. Well, the Rosh, however, disagrees. And he says that this is like shooting arrows off of your property. He says, he says, because even though the animal does not belong to you, but if I take someone else's animal and I directly drag the animal and place it over my neighbor's vegetation, and I say, here, doggy, go ahead and eat Mrs. Smith's azaleas, right? And the dog goes ahead and does it. So because I've directly led the dog directly over to her flowers, then I'm going to be liable for those damages. So that's the way the Rush views it. And he says it's not a matter of ownership. And so but it's like shooting an arrow. What if I take my friend's arrow and I shoot you? Does that mean that I'm exempt? No. I've caused the form of damage that is independent of ownership. It's not a damage of shane, it's a damage of shooting arrows, of human damage. And therefore, mishum shane afilu bevehema she'eno shelo ayin sham. And therefore, it is a form of shane, but it's a form of shane where I'm liable even when the animal does not belong to me. So this is the machlokas. There's two ways of viewing this. And I would suggest, although I'd have to do a little bit more research to be absolutely certain, but I would suggest that when the Rav Shulchan Aruch says that you're not going to be, that there's no restriction if the neighborhood is non-Jewish, he's holding like the Ramban, that it's a matter of darchei shalom, of keeping the peace, that is a rabbinic law, and that it's not a law of damages. And that's the reason why this distinction is drawn, because if it's an actual form of damage, there really is no distinction between in halacha between a Jew and a non-Jew. That's that's what I'm thinking, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay, but now of course, these halachas will all be superseded by whatever the municipal law is. So, but it's just interesting to see the origin of this halacha. Let's go on to the next halacha, Yud Zayin.
Rabbi, just a quick question.
Yes.
One of the concerns people would have a lot about pigeons would be that the pigeons nearby are coming to my property and they're pooping all over my property. So is that a form of damage? Is that a concern here? Because that would be an issue today that a lot of people would have.
Pigeons pooping on property. Say that 10 times fast. But
yes, it's a triple P threat.
Yeah. So it's interesting that that's not the part of halacha that's brought down that's not even cited by the Gemara. It would seem to me that bird poop is probably one of the least issues of concern in the ancient and medieval world. There are so many other things having to do with mud and human waste and everything like that are, it's just a dirty society.
Yeah.
General.
I don't think they had poop and scoop laws, but there's a sign near the bridge where I walk that says "Don't feed the pigeons because they'll poop all over, and the sidewalk's still covered with it." So I think that is a first world problem for sure, or a 2020 kind of problem.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a first world problem. Yeah, or a modern world problem. But it is interesting what you said, Paul, about there being ordinances even today. I know that there's a certain street that in Yerushalayim, it's called Rehov Strauss, and I don't know if it still has this problem, but when I was a yeshiva bacher, you'd walk down up Rehov Strauss, and it was first of all very, very loud because there were a lot of birds in the trees. It was very, very big trees. And it was known that if you walked down this street, you were going to get pelted by bird poop. So you had to really choose your route very carefully.
I mean, I think because they have wings, it's kind of like squirrels. People think they're cute, but they're flying vermin, and I think they do spread disease as well. So I think it's a real issue. It's not just a bother. I think people just have come to realize now that the pigeon poo does carry disease as well.
Okay. All right. Yud Zayin. Next halacha. Asur lahashlich nevela be'ir v'chutz la'ir toch nun ama mipnei hareach shemazik lifnei ha'ir. So now we're actually going to get into acts of malfeasance that create bad odor to the neighborhood. You're not allowed to cause damage by creating a stink. So here are some of the examples. You're not allowed to throw a carcass of a dead animal you're not allowed to just discard it in the city if it's within 50 amas of habitation. And the reason is because of the stench that is going to be offensive to the members of the city. You notice it doesn't talk about disease. It doesn't talk about bacterial infections. These are all become modern issues of, there must have been a lot of bacterial infections in the old world. They didn't have antibiotics. Plus, they didn't know a lot of the principles of hygiene, that if you leave rotting flesh within your vicinity, this could cause disease. But the argument goes that it's because of reyach, it's because of a bad odor. Ele im kain kulam mashlichim nivlosehem b'shuk o ba'ash b'shuk. Unless, he writes in the parentheses, this is the common practice. If you live in a community where everyone throws their animal carcasses, and what are we talking about? Either you had a sheepdog on your property and your dog dies. Well, what are you going to do with the dog? You can either bury it, or you can just toss the carcass. Or let's say you and your family had a barbecue. You barbecued a sheep and you roasted it in the backyard, and everyone partook of it. And now all you have left is a carcass of the leftovers, and you just want to dump it. So if the convention is that there's a designated area within the city where everyone dumps their garbage in the marketplace, then that's okay. Then you're allowed to do it because that's the convention. Because the community members do have a right to say, this is our convention. And if we all agree that we don't mind the bad odor, then that's fine. And similarly, ha'osa beis hakisei kavua b'chatzero tzarich lasos be'inyan shelo yagia hareach lishcheino o livnei rishus haram. Or if a person makes an outhouse on his property, he has to be careful not to allow the odor to go onto his neighbor's property. or to the members of the public thoroughfare. So if you live in a particularly windy area and you know that the wind constantly blows downhill, you can't put your outhouse right next to your neighbor's property if you know the wind is constantly going to be blowing on his property. Or if there's a public sidewalk, a public street that's right near your property, you can't set up something that's going to have an offensive odor to the members of the public. Okay, so this is really the first time we're talking about odor. And again, even in the ancient world, there must have been some point of saying, okay, we don't all smell like a strawberry, but there does come a point even for us where this is no longer tolerable. Let me just think. In modern times, I know that there can sometimes, if a person is putting tar on their roof, that's probably one of the smelliest things you can do in a construction project is to apply tar. And if that was going on with regularity, let's say you were manufacturing a product that gave off a very noxious kind of odor, so then that would apply as well. And so similarly, you have to be careful that if you set up an outdoor oven that constantly gives off smoke, you have to make sure that the smoke doesn't regularly go on your neighbor's property through a common wind. An uncommon wind you don't have to worry about, but if it's just a common breeze will transport smoke onto your neighbor's property, that can cause actual damage. So up until now, we've seen that in this halacha, just standard practice for normal neighbors that are not sensitive in any way. But let's say the imyesh lishcheno choli harosh. But let's say your neighbor has a certain head problem. He has a certain malady of the head. It's not just, it doesn't sound like it's a headache. It sounds like it's a chronic problem. Let's say like he's got migraines. Umazik lo, a lot of stuff here. Umazik lo kol haka'a, and the sound of loud noises causes him an exacerbation of his headaches, and it causes him to really, really suffer. So lo yichtosh rifos v'chayotze bohem midvarim shekol haka'asam magia lebeishcheno umaziklo. So then you're not allowed to engage in noisy activity on your property. The example that is provided here is to grind grits. That's what rifot are grits. Let's say you have a mill on your property, and there's certain kinds of products that when you grind them in a mill, they make a very, very loud noise. So he says you're not allowed to do that. I was just commenting to my wife, we were walking on Shabbos, and the noisiest thing in the world, and it's the most annoying thing, especially when you're trying to take a nap or sleep, is these landscapers with the blowers. I think that what a great invention would be low noise blowers. That if we could figure out a way, patent a new kind of motor, a muffler, put a muffler on your blower. I don't even understand why there's no city ordinance that restricts these, because it's the noisiest thing in the world. Yeah, but the problem is that if you're a professional landscaper, your battery's gonna run out very quickly. I don't know if maybe the technology is there. I really don't know, but it seems to me that would be a great. Maybe you should start working on that, Mordechai. Work on a low noise, and also and I don't understand why in every community this is tolerated, but it's a real thing, because how many times have you been woken up by a guy who starts landscaping on your property a little bit early on a Sunday morning, or what? Could be. But in any event, if you know that your neighbor does suffer from noise that you're making, even though he has a condition that makes him suffer, you could arguably say, it's not my problem that my neighbor has an unusual condition that he's overly sensitive to noise. But no, the halacha is sensitive to that. You have to make sure that you don't do certain activities that's going to exacerbate your neighbor's medical issue. Right? Even though normally a normal person would be able to tolerate that, but you have to go above and beyond the letter of the law. So I want to pursue this a little bit further, and we'll continue this Imrei Hashem over the course of the week. Have a great day, everybody.